Should be on now. I'll do the second. Trying to get things straight. Logan is live. Yeah, I just got the notification. Yeah, it's the second one.
Okay.
Not the
On your
original.
phone, can you delete your original?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll make a note of it as well.
I'll do it for myself.
It's fine. I'll just maybe no one's really good at it. It's like the symbiote.
This one. It's not. There's one on the wall.
Just put it on the side. Yes, there's. I shared the PowerPoint. It's called What's the Goal of Student Protest?
Where's Tommy? Tommy?
What? Logan, what? I thought you were staring at me. I was
Oh,
like,
no.
sorry, what? No, actually, I was like, what?
Sure.
It was like at the top.
There it is.
He's just trying to set you up. You know, just
Hello. Hi everyone. Okay, we're gonna get started. Hello to everyone on our live stream who's viewing right now. Hello to all the students who are here. Thank you everyone for coming. Just a few things before we get started. We are, in case you don't know, the University of Arizona Discourse series. Our mission statement is that we are trying our best to elevate the state of public discourse by trying to take out the sort of competitive point-scoring nature of debate and introduce the discourse, reintroduce the discourse, and bring back the art of conversation. We're doing a special version of that tonight to really try and emphasize exactly what we're talking about. Normally, the way that our debates would run is that we would have people either answering yes or answering no to a question, but instead tonight we're trying to do something a little bit more nuanced, and we have a much more open-ended question that we're going to be voting on. In case anyone is new to the program that we do, the way that this is going to run is this. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then they're going to come on up here. One person from each side is going to give you an introduction to what it is that they are going to be arguing. That's especially important for you to listen to in this particular debate, because you won't actually know what their stance is until you hear them start talking, again, since we don't really have a yes or no question here today. Secondly, we're going to have a second round where our debaters are going to have a chance to address each other. They're going to be able to answer some of my questions for clarification and answer some of your questions, so have some questions ready. It'll be great to hear from you, the audience. And then finally, we're going to have our third and final round where our debaters will have one last chance to be able to get your vote. Normally, we would take a preliminary vote and a post-debate vote and decide the winner based on who is changing the audience's mind the most, but again, we can't really do that tonight because you don't even really know what it is that you're voting on preliminarily until you start to hear what it is that they're going to be arguing. So I'm really excited to hear what it is that our debaters have to say tonight. A few more things before we open up our arguments. I do want to say thank you, because it's the last event that we have of our entire semester. I want to say thank you to all of our interns who are just the absolute greatest people in the world. Every single time that we have like a new crop of interns come in, I'm like, I don't want these people to graduate, and then people graduate, and then I'm like, we're never going to find people again, and then we end up having just like an amazing family of interns. So I do want to say thank you to all of our interns. So give a round of applause to the hardest working interns in the world. I do also want to just point out again, if anybody wants pizza, there's free pizza. If anybody wants to grab a slice, you're more than welcome to do it. Just try to be too disruptive as you're getting up and walking over to get it. Or be disruptive. We're talking about disruptive protests tonight, so go ahead and do it if you want to get mad about it. And I also, just one last thing that I think is probably really important to point out. Tonight is the very last event that we're going to have our absolute superstar intern, Riley Haas. So I just want to say goodbye to her. We have to get a huge round of applause for Riley, who his entire program was not in. But don't let that sway where you're going to vote tonight, because she is one of our panelists. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Tonight's question is going, again, to not be a yes or no question, but instead is going to ask, what should the goal of student protests be? What should the goal of student protests be? That's what we're asking tonight. Obviously, we saw a lot of protests around the country, and particularly on our campus last spring, and we wanted to make sure that we had at least one event that focused on the really complex nature of that protest. So in order to do that, we want to make sure that we're having that conversation tonight. And I don't even know how to introduce each one of the sides, so I'm just going to go ahead and say, opening up on the side arguing for what he's about to tell us that he's arguing for, we have Logan.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see a good number of faces here. If you're here because you have to be, I'm sure this isn't exactly what you want to be doing, but don't worry, we'll try to make it interesting. As Ted mentioned, my name is Logan Brabant. My partner is Payton Hussman. Tonight we will be arguing that the goal of student protests should be to advocate for social and emotional awareness. So while we recognize the opposing stance is probably the most simple and the most appealing, there are a few things that we need to address. So how do we get started here? So one of the main points is that change doesn't always have to be through legislation. There's a few historical examples that we can look to, and also some more modern examples of protests. The Me Too movement is a good example. Black Lives Matter protests are a good example. Now, the opposition would have to label these as failures if they want to maintain their stance that legislation is the ultimate goal of protests. You and I, we all agree that some kind of change has always been the goal of any protest, and for us as students, that's no different. I mean, think of last year, there was a lot of stuff that went on. With that, I completely understand if you're under the impression that legislation is the main goal. I never said our position was the easiest. But, like any good demonstration is intended to do, Payton and I are going to intend to show you why and how we think our position is the stronger one. So the first aspect of our argument is awareness. Protests have always done a great job in raising awareness regardless of their forms. Rallies, demonstrations, marches, sit-ins, they all do one thing extremely well, and that's raising awareness. The people who go to these protests, people like you and I, we all realize that change is only possible by drawing attention to some issue. Just think logically. If people don't know about suffering, they won't see any reason to advocate for change. Protests provide us with exposure and awareness of the problems in the world so that we may begin fixing them. Knowing this, we will demonstrate how critical it is for student protesters, like you and I, to maximize the attention that we garner towards our movement in order to seek change. Now let me again draw attention to something I said previously. Change. Not legislation, but change. The more exposure an issue has, the more support it will get from the public, and change becomes more likely. The opposing side will attempt to argue that rather than exposure and awareness, student protesters should instead prioritize methods that best achieve the goal of legislative change. Again, we all agree that some kind of change is the best outcome of a protest, and there are many instances of legislative change that have come out of protests. However, their stance ignores two key things. First, legislative change is only possible if society becomes aware of a need for some kind of legislative action. Once again, if people are unaware of issues, they have no reason to see a need for action. Consider this. All right, we're going to use you guys. By show of hands, who voted in Arizona in this previous election? Awesome. Round of applause for you guys. All right, now keep those hands up. Out of those hands that are up, well, let's start with this. There are many propositions for Arizona in this recent election. Keep those hands up if you understood word for word what each of those propositions meant. Okay? Now, I know I didn't understand them all either. And this demonstrates my point. We only care about an issue enough to know about it, to research it, and to act upon it if we're exposed to it. Once again, awareness. The second issue the opposing side will have to wiggle their way out of is one I've mentioned a couple of times, and is the most important detail of tonight. Change does not always mean legislation. Let me go one step further. Change does not always need legislation. There are plenty of examples of protests that have created change that has nothing to do with legislation. Consider the likes of the Me Too movement, June 2020's Blackout Tuesday, or even 1975's Take Back the Night movement. We will go into great detail on all of these. Once again, the opposition would have to label these instances as failures due to a lack of legislative change. However, you and I, we recognize that these movements were successful in gradually shifting society's attention to these issues and resulted in social and cultural changes that legislation may not have accomplished. For the last time in this opening, change does not always mean legislation. With this all in mind, we aim to demonstrate that not only does the opposition stance disregard important components of what exactly makes a protest successful, but we also aim to solidify the fact that no matter what specific kinds of change student protesters seek to make, like you and I, an increase in society's awareness will always be integral to a protest success and instigating, and should always be the primary intention of student protests moving forward. Our generation has seen what happens when we are content to let the government take care of our problems. Frankly, we've had enough, and it's time to take matters into our own hands. I hope that by the end of this, your main takeaway is that your voice, your actions, they all matter and you can make a difference. You don't have to sit and wait for some Congress member to solve the problems of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Logan. And opening up the other side, which again remains up in the air, we'll find out exactly what they're arguing on the question of what it is that the goal of student protest should be. We have Riley.
You just heard our opponent speak, and we can understand why you may think that the goal of protest should be focused on community and student activism. It can feel extremely difficult to cause meaningful change through the government and universities, and focusing on what we can accomplish as students can feel a lot more meaningful. To make it clear, we're not here to argue that there's nothing that we as students alone can accomplish, but rather that many big issues need policy change in order to combat issues. We have two main arguments as to why the primary goal of student protest should be policy change. The first being that policy-driven protests have a lasting impact that student mobilization alone cannot ensure. The second point we offer is that monumental issues such as climate change cannot be addressed without policy change. Before further explaining our argument for policy change, I want to clarify what we mean. When we reference policy change, we're talking about changing laws, policies, regulations, procedures, etc. At its core, policy change is a shift in the way that business as usual is done. And protests centered on specific policy objectives have a long track record of success. The civil rights movement, for example, while not solely a student-led movement, raised awareness for racial inequality with its primary focus being on policy reforms that later led to landmark legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act in 1964, legislation that still impacts us 6 decades later. A similar example is the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. It focused on ending university investments in apartheid South Africa. These protests, with a large focus on policy change, led to many universities divesting from South Africa, ultimately contributing to the end of the apartheid there. Think about what has happened to protests that focus on generating community mobilization without policy goals. An example is Occupy Wall Street. It was massive in 2011, focused on generating further protests and community organizing against wealth inequality in the US after the Great Recession. It was successful in inspiring numerous protests globally. However, it fizzled out due to a lack of any specific policy goals to direct the protest energy towards. 13 years later, the issue that they were protesting is only worse, with no legacy to show for community-focused protesting. My partner Jakob and I plan to talk about multiple successful policy-driven student protests that led to real change on issues at a governmental and university level, such as the Vietnam War, Black Lives Matter campus protests, gun violence, educational reforms, and many others. All of these student protests have one thing in common. They are pressing issues with wide-reaching impacts. Without changing the policies surrounding these issues, there's nothing we can do to address them. Focusing our protests as students on part of policies that can be implemented or reformed leads to lasting impact regarding critical problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Riley. I'm not sure I'm the one who should have this microphone, but it's the only microphone that works, and I feel like I'd be like tipping my hand in one way or the other if I handed the microphone to one side or the other. So, all right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our second round. And again, the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask a few questions of clarification from both sides. They're going to be able to address each other, and then we'll take questions from the audience. But before I do that, I think it's probably imperative that if I can just summarize maybe what it is that I'm hearing each side say. It sounds as though Logan and Payton's argument is essentially talking about that the goal of student protests should be community action, non-legislative community action, and raising awareness, right? It sounds like that's mainly sort of what it is that you guys are talking about. And it sounds like you guys are saying that all that sounds great, but really any kind of policy, whether it be legislation or administrative policy, something that's actually written down by an institution is the best way. Does that sound about right? Okay, great, cool. So we have pretty clear sides then. So then let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask my first question over here since these guys just spoke. Can you guys talk a little bit more about what kind of examples, I mean, you said that you were going to get into some more examples of the kind of non-legislative activism that you're more interested in. Can you give us some more examples of the kinds of activism that you think would be best, would be the ideal role?
Sure. So now that the hard part's over, I'm a lot more confident. Let me just read off some quotes of some of the examples that we have. So Take Back the Night. This was a movement early in the 70s following increased events of women's sexual violence. This is from their website. Our global mission as a charitable foundation is to end sexual violence in all forms, including sexual assault, sexual abuse, trafficking, stalking, gender harassment, and relationship violence, and to support survivors in their healing journeys. We foster safe communities through international events and initiatives. Take Back the Night events unite people from every background, belief, and culture around the world to take a visible and vocal stand. So that's from their website. So that's just one of the examples that we have. There's a bunch of others that we can get into more on the details if we go down that route.
So it sounds like in that example, we're looking at something that's closer to sort of just showing other people that you exist, right? Just having more of a sense of community for people who are also sort of affected by the issues that you're talking about. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Sure, yeah. I think that our reasoning for taking that quote, we have others here as well from other protest organizations, is to really emphasize this fact that, A, it's worldwide and it's kind of difficult to get a policy passed worldwide when we have a worldwide problem, right? But B, this is about unity. This is about people, real people, coming together and sharing their thoughts, sharing their experiences, and uniting under something they become aware of because they've been exposed to a protest, right? So with Take Back the Night, this was a worldwide thing. It started in Belgium, and then it made its way to the United States. And we had instances of, be it in cities, be it in on college campuses, of people rallying, not really around any particular kind of policy goal, but around the fact that women are being taken advantage of. And we may not have a perfect idea of a specific policy to hammer down to limit that, but more importantly, we can spread the fact that this is happening, and through everybody hopefully mutually understanding that this is probably a bad thing that's happening, raising our awareness and taking steps on an individual or small community level to minimize this happening.
Okay, great. What's your response?
Sure, absolutely. We really appreciate the point. And talking a lot about awareness, that we absolutely agree awareness is essential because that can mobilize people. But the question that we have is towards what goal? They talk about towards individual and community-based, but we're not really hearing specific answers with this protest of what change did this actually lead to lasting. So a question I have is, specifically in the example you raised, specifically with this example, what change came out of that lasted well after the protest ended?
Sure. So I don't have a quote from this protest, but I have one from a similar one, which is the Me Too movement. We're all more familiar with this one because it was for our lives. Take Back the Night, although it still has small chapters going on today, it was in the 1970s, and I imagine most of you weren't around for that. But the Me Too movement is something that we were all here for. And again, it's this idea of individual change, individual awareness, and spreading this idea amongst your community such that we A, recognize that this is something we're uncomfortable with, we don't want permeating our communities, and B, taking individual and community action to do this. So one quote I have from a father regarding his reaction to the Me Too movement, talking about his sons, he says, "Men do not have a good history when it comes to promoting women and treating them as equals. So I welcome the #MeToo era, and I accept the challenge of raising boys that will be part of a new group of men who treat women as equals." Again, it's this idea of we are raising people, real people, that have wills, have compassion, things that a simple legislative law does not inherently carry.
And just to add on to that, one thing that really did change is male behavior regarding women. I think that's a very important thing that we need to address.
But I'd actually like to clarify on the...
Before we start, Jacob, I just want to make sure. Again, I'm the one who has the microphone, so if you guys can be sure that you are projecting as loud as you possibly can out of the audience, that would be really, really great, because I can barely hear you, and I'm 4 feet away from you. Go ahead.
We're actually glad that they brought up the example of Me Too as an example of protest without a policy goal. They did have policy goals. For example, and that led to real policy change. They didn't fix the issues raised by the awareness of the protest, but made a meaningful step towards progress. One example is California passing a law banning non-disclosure agreements in sexual misconduct and sexual assault cases. Like, this is one example of specific policy that allowed more women to be able to speak out during this movement and not be restricted by an NDA. So the Me Too movement isn't an example of a successful protest without a policy goal. It had policy goals and actually led to change.
Cool.
Sure. Although I do think that, we've had laws on the books already, right? I mean, we're talking women's rights to vote. We have the First Amendment, which exists and is supposed to give equal rights for speech, access to things, but nonetheless, we've still had problems with that for a long time. And we can look at one that you mentioned in your opening, this idea of the Civil Rights Act, right? The Civil Rights Movement, integral to broadening the equality in our country. And we're very happy that policy was a big moment, a big culminating moment for that. But even after the Civil Rights Act was passed, we still had rampant racism. Policy alone is not what was able to fix that, although it was an integral step, and we on this position are not hating or disliking a policy. We're happy when it comes, but the core of where change is going to come from is going to be within those communities, those individuals. In the South, for decades, and we could argue even today, seeing that we still have BLM going on, racism still exists, and policies, although we've passed a lot of them, is not enough, quite frankly. People are still suffering, and while policy was integral to making that less of a problem in our world today, what's really been eking us towards a true equality is we as people, individual people, recognizing that the likes of African Americans, the likes of women, the likes of any other group is equal to us.
So let me ask on that, just like ask this question over here. So why is it that that legislation or policy or anything like that, why is it that you guys feel that that is the most important goal that we can possibly have? Because they're needing a lot of sort of just sort of social change that ends up happening as a result of these things. So why is it that policy and legislation are so vitally important?
Yeah, we feel as though it's so important because while social awareness and change is a side effect of student protests, it shouldn't be the main focal point. It can't ensure that this change that we're protesting, that we're putting our time and energy into as students, is going to be here for the generations that follow. And I mean, I'm a student too. I know we have busy lives. And just to put all that effort into something that's a little social blimp is kind of disheartening. And this legislation ensures that we're not doing that this is really going to be lasting impact for time to come.
I've actually seen the very dynamic way I've been talked about on campus and policy-driven student protests that I've been a part of at this university. I'm a member of an organization called the Arizona Divest, which is focused on getting our university to stop investing in fossil fuels. It is about raising awareness about the issue of climate change and then motivating people to care about that. But a lot of times what we can face without policy goals is people could feel there's nothing we can do about it. This issue is too large. We're powerless. But we took specific, actionable, concrete steps in policy change towards our administration, and we've nearly finished with our administration agreeing to cut off all investments with fossil fuels by 2030. That if we had just gone with purely raising awareness, as more of what our opponents are advocating for, we would have had a lot of people feel that there was nothing they could do to be a part of addressing such a systemic issue.
One thing there, so you said social change, cultural change, that's like more of a side effect. I would disagree. I would say actually policy is more of a side effect. I mean, policy is only around so long as the government wants it there. I mean, it is trivially easy, not to get too political, but it is very, very easy for, say, the Supreme Court or the presidency or Congress to just throw out a law. I mean, we've seen that on multiple occasions, even in the last few years. So I would say there is a lot more permanence to our side of the argument than yours is.
And then just to build off of that, you had mentioned that the awareness was a side effect of the policy, but in fact I think it's the other way around. In order to have a policy passed, you need either literal votes or support for that policy, and that's only going to come if people are aware of an issue and emotionally rallied against its importance. In turn, it would be the policy, the votes you need to pass it, the support you need to pass it would actually be the side effect.
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify what I said too, by the way, I said that the social and cultural awareness was a side effect of the protests, not the policy change. Sorry.
So, as a clarifying question, just to give another example, the March for Our Lives movements in Florida after the Parkland shooting massacre, student protesters focused on a variety of policy goals that they got passed in the Florida legislature, such as a mandatory 3-day waiting period, an age of 21 for buying rifles, and having other specific reforms. And the question I ask for you is, would you have told those protesters, those student protesters who organized and got real policy change on an issue like gun violence, that they shouldn't have focused on policy change? And if so, what else could they have done to address an issue like gun violence that's so much that is driven by that policy?
So I'm glad you asked that. And absolutely, we're not saying that policy goals shouldn't be the goal of any protest or that's an outcome is a bad thing. I mean, I mentioned in my opening, change should always be the ultimate goal. But we're more saying, why should we be satisfied with a piece of legislation? You know, there's so much we can do as a culture, as a society, to stop the gun violence that is going on in our country, rather than just passing a bill on a piece of paper. But there's so much more that we can do. Do you not agree?
I guess as a clarifying point off of that, to address that, are you saying then that for the March for Our Life movement, it would have been a more effective protest if they had not had any specific policy goals, but instead focused purely on raising awareness about the issue?
No, I fully grant that. I mean, guns are a specific, unique problem to the United States, and legislation is certainly one of the best ways to address it. But we don't think that a view of legislation alone being the primary goal every single time is as effective or useful as it could be. So in your case, yeah, of course, with guns, that's something that's very difficult to address outside of legislation, but there are other things that we can discuss, more foundational things. Why does gun violence happen? Well, sure, guns are available, we can probably restrict them, but we also have mental health issues. Why not rally our communities around supporting those around us who might be at risk of doing something unforgivable? Our point is that, well, yes, in your case of that protest, policy was certainly effective, and we were certainly for policy when it's good and comes about. There's a more foundational aspect that we think protests root their power in that isn't specifically related to policy passing.
So I absolutely appreciate there are a wide variety of points to gun violence, but I do want to exemplify what they just acknowledged, that in the specific example we brought up of such a systemic issue as gun violence text wasn't enough.
I want to focus on an issue that I've heard actually both sides bring up, which is this sort of issue of powerlessness or frustration or sort of the futility. So I want to hear kind of from both sides, both from this side, why it is that you feel as though it is particularly frustrating, and it is sometimes sort of like you feel as though we're hitting roadblocks when we're relying on institutions to pass legislation, and why it is that you guys feel that you still have faith in those institutions to actually be able to push forward that kind of legislation. So we'll start with you guys.
Sure. So one thing immediately is, and again, not to get too political, but I imagine there are quite a few people in here that were not very satisfied with the previous election. And I was talking to one of my friends last night about this debate, actually, and was bouncing ideas off him. And he came up with this great quote. It's, the government should not force the people to change. The people should force the government to change. So the fact that people are unsatisfied with the government means that it is not representing us all. I mean, the government is here to represent the needs of the people, the wants of the people. And we just feel as if that's not the case. I mean, just look at the most recent Congress. They were one of the most useless in all of American history.
And then just to build off of that, this idea of, well, okay, we have governments, and they're very effective. I'm proud of our democracy, okay? But I think we recognize that given how many moving parts we have, how many different kinds of cultures, different perspectives we have to acknowledge, it's a slow-moving system. This is the kind of thing that is not helped by majorities or even minorities, filibusters, all kinds of problems with the legislative process. But more importantly, these things take time, and laws don't last forever. I mean, Roe v. Wade just got overturned, and we had a lot of protest, a lot of outcry about the need for women's health to be addressed. And while that was successful in passing a policy, there's one of many examples of policy not lasting. But what is lasting is the sentiment of women's health mattering, women mattering. It's something we need to address, and that's permeated our society, even though the policy itself has failed.
Okay, and then yeah, back to you. Why is it that you have faith in the institutions to be able to enact this kind of policy?
Yeah, so I have faith in the institutions, mostly because I have faith in the students who are pressing the institutions to keep doing it, to keep asking for change. And to touch on the example you offered before of the University of Virginia rape scandal that led to more protests, very little systemic change came from this, and the Department of Justice still reports that about 96 of campus rapes go unreported for women. So clearly there's a huge issue that we have to face that social awareness just can't even begin to conquer.
And to add on to that, Faith, to also clarify, when we're talking about change, we're not just talking at the level of Congress and the federal government, state governments, local governments, university, as an example of the protests I've been a part of. And part of the reason that I've personally had faith in the institutions is seeing, like, the administration, when Robbins was still the president, that very much seemed like we're not going to be able to have change, but when we continue to work through the process with actionable goals that directed the energy that we all have towards the common issue of climate change, even with an administration like the Brabant administration, I mean, that's a fair statement. But even with that, we were still able to get them to agree to divestment within a few years. I mean, even with this context, we didn't decide to just, it's too difficult, we're not going to change. We persevered and continued forward and made a lasting difference.
I'll let you guys respond. One last question that I want to ask after you guys are done, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. So go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want this to be a pro-government, anti-government kind of thing. I mean, that's not what the spirit of the discussion is. But we just feel like there's so much more that we can accomplish, like I've mentioned a couple times. So I guess one question that I would have is, why do we need to be complacent or satisfied with letting the government fix our issues? I mean, we're all people. We can do the things that we want to do. I mean, this is all about activism. This in itself is, in the sense, kind of a protest. I mean, we're talking about issues and we're trying to create a change. This doesn't have anything to do with policy, but we're still driving forward through a cultural shift and a social shift that is very, very important, and it's talking about things.
So to briefly respond to that, it's not being complacent. We're not just saying, government, do whatever you want. We're being the agents driving, whether it's the government or our universities or businesses, to then make the change that we want to see. That's not.
Yeah, okay. Let me ask you a last question, then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. And because we mentioned the University of Arizona and here specifically, I don't want to talk too much about the actual specific issue, because that's going to, I think, derail us a bit much. But just let's look at the protests that happened this past spring, and I just want to hear both sides sort of weigh in on how effective or ineffective or what you think the proper goals were or should have been, or all that kind of stuff. So if you could weigh in a little bit on what it is that we saw this past spring with the student protests that have happened, how the university reacted, all that kind of stuff. I know that's a lot to tell you to briefly respond to, but if you could briefly respond, I'll start over here.
Sure. So I'm a senior now, so I was here last spring. My dad, who's in the audience, is a sergeant of the TPD, and he actually works the protests. So I have friends who were there on both sides, and I know quite a bit about it. It touched me personally. And my understanding of it, given social media, we have a lot more access to issues from all over the world. And one thing that I believe to be true of most, if not all people, is that we're all compassionate. And when we see people suffering, that's going to get an emotional response out of people, hopefully. But you're not going to get a response to something if you're not aware of it, right? But media made some of our students aware of it, and they had a stronger emotional reaction, and they felt an obligation to share their voice, use their power, take advantage of their platform, being the U of A, and share their opinions on what they thought the U of A should do. And whether or not it was effective, I mean, I know it's very divisive for a lot of people here. It ended up getting not violent, but definitely very chaotic, and we can argue over the specific strategies, how effective they were. But I think the root of it was people saw an issue going on, and they wanted people to be aware of it, to recognize that suffering was happening, and that I imagine most of us care if suffering is happening, and it's through knowing that suffering is happening where we can come together, change what we can in our communities to alleviate that moving forward.
Okay, great. You guys want to talk?
Sure, absolutely. That we're obviously not touching on the specific issue, but
Yeah.
talking about the strategies. We've actually seen, because there were so many protests at different universities across our country and internationally, we saw certain protests that had more specific policy goals, like, for example, Portland State University, their protest very much centered on divestment from Boeing because of manufacturing weapons being sent over to the conflict. Portland successfully divested from Boeing. That it did raise awareness about the conflict, but for these certain examples where they had that specific policy goal, and they directed towards that the university administration could act on, they saw that change. But when we had protests that more just focused on raising awareness generally about the conflict, that yes, it can incite, it can raise emotions and make people care about the conflict, but without those specific goals, at the end of the day, there's not a ton of change that's able to be had that can last after the protests.
So yeah, I wasn't here for the spring. I'm our first year actually, so I don't have as much knowledge, especially firsthand knowledge. But one thing I'll add is, we can talk about all these policy things, and they are good as we've mentioned, but there's just not enough. I mean, we mentioned the Civil Rights Act that passed, and racism was still around. So I mean, there's so many instances of examples that are like that, where our voices are just so much more powerful than what some Congress member is doing. Especially as a collective, like this room, we hold a lot of influence that we don't quite realize. We can shift our culture so much. Like, it is just we are very, very powerful, and I hope that is just the main takeaway of tonight.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. We as students have so much power. But to touch on that just a little bit, I don't necessarily think that.
So just to clarify what they keep trying to talk about, that we've had policy change, but it's not enough. We cannot hold for any change that perfection is the standard of progress. That with an issue like racial justice or climate change or gun reform, that we're never going to fix such complex issues and such difficult issues overnight with any single legislation. But with more mobilization and with further work and continuing that drive, then we can continue that forward trajectory.
But is the point of the argument not what should the goals of protest be? I mean, you're saying, policy is the greatest thing ever, but it doesn't do enough, and that's the status quo. We're not arguing for the status quo. We're saying we should be able to do more, and we can do more. So I guess I'm just confused as to.
I guess we could also sit here and argue that social awareness necessarily isn't enough. If we look at society today, we're split right down the middle. There are certain social issues that even if there's a mass amount of awareness about them, we all just simply can't seem to agree on or come to the same conclusion about. And that's why policy, it might not be perfect as well, but it's concrete, it's there, it's in writing, and it offers something for generations to follow.
Payton, last word, and then let's get to the audience.
I think just to clarify, I think everybody in here can agree that both policy and social awareness are not perfect things. One of them tends to happen to be a little more concrete, faster. One of them's maybe not as fast. I mean, we're talking lifetimes. Seeing a protest when you're young and realizing that that's going to cultivate who you are as you grow up. But I think that the more important thing is that social awareness, compassion, fostering good virtues within our people through demonstrating that issues exist and rallying them around it, is what lasts. I mean, this is what composes of our character, right? We see something and we react to it. And if we're compassionate people, which I like to think we all are, hopefully, we will react in the ways that we know how. Part of that could be voting. We do have power, but others could be talking to that friend who maybe disagrees with you, who doesn't quite understand. Maybe going onto social media and doing something. But these are all things that you have power to do. And when you do all of these things, including using your votes, it's this core value of a character change that is lasting and will eventually cause the better, more effective change in our culture.
Okay, let's get to the audience. Before we get to the audience, I don't know if Tommy's still in the room, but we are going to need to have the QR code up on the screen at the end of the debate so that we can actually vote. So if you could hop back on there. Well, what's up?
It doesn't work.
What do you mean?
I'm afraid that it does not work.
All right, let's get to the questions from the audience. Who has some questions for either side of our debaters, or for both sides of our debaters? Yeah, great.
So when policy is like codified,
Is this for one
this
side
is
or
for
the other?
both sides.
Okay.
When policy is codified or is passed, does that sort of mark the end of the movement? Maybe it like fizzles out, or do you think that adds sort of wind under its wings and maybe makes it progress further?
Great question. Yeah. We'll start with you.
When wind under its wings, if you're still having the issue that's ongoing, it just marks a step along the process. Just to use like my personal experience with this, that we've gotten some policy passed with our environmental organizing on campus, but we haven't gotten all of it passed. So we're not just resting on our laurels once we've gotten that change done. We've used that change to show that what we're doing is successful and continue until we've accomplished all of our goals.
And I guess to maybe sort of rephrase the question for this side, if policy isn't the end goal, when is the end of the movement? Or is there sort of never an end to the movement if we're talking about social change?
I don't know. I think intuitively it sounds like there wouldn't be an end, right? Human nature, we're all different and we all have conflicts. And while certainly progress can be made, there's always going to be something else that happens, something else that separates us, right? But it's a matter of recognizing that this process is happening. It could be over racial rates or racial discrimination. It could be over gender discrimination. It could be over which political side you lean on. There's always going to be something, and legislation can certainly be powerful, depending on the nuance of the issue. It could stop it outright, and we fix it until something happens later. Or what I think is more often going to happen is there's going to be something else that comes up, and it's going to be us and our character being shaped such that we can react to it compassionately to make the change.
Do you guys want to respond, or we can take another
I
question?
think we're good for another question.
Okay, great. Let's take another question from the audience. Who else has a question for either side of our debaters here? Yeah, great.
I have a question.
Yeah, great.
So what about policy that negatively affects the community? What should the community do in terms of changing that, or how should they go about that?
What about bad policies? What happens when bad policies are?
I think that's such a good question, and our response would be the same way. Protest it, you know what I mean? To get it changed, reformed, or whatever. A lot of policies right now that are being implemented aren't necessarily completely new, but just revisions of old policies that have already existed.
So just to give a concrete example of what we're advocating for, with the protests in student campuses at the U.S. against apartheid, the protests were against university policies that were funding South African countries and the South African government propping up apartheid, a very bad policy that harmed a large portion of marginalized communities. So they protested to then reverse those policies and pass good policies, banning those financial investments in South Africa. That then led to the end of apartheid.
You guys want to respond? Let's say to bad policies.
Sure. So I think even good policies aren't enough. I mean, we talked about how courts and other legal changes can just wipe out a good policy on a whim, and it happens too. So it again just comes down to why should we be satisfied with policy? We can do much more. Cultural change is far more permanent, in my opinion, than any piece of legislation.
And then just to kind of specifically tackle your question, I mean, what do we mean when we say a bad policy, right? I imagine when a policy was drafted and implemented, it was probably at least moderately light around the time it was passed, right? But what changes is time. What changes is culture. And our policy is what needs to grow and change to reflect that as our culture and the people, the ones with the voices, the ones with the votes, come to address that. And as time changes, as culture changes, as we all hopefully get closer to a more compassionate society, we're going to recognize that some of these policies are actually bad and we should address them. But it's going to be brought about by that core value of we're growing more compassionate, we're growing more inclusive, and our government is not reflecting that, so we need to address it with our power.
Do we have any other questions from the audience before we move to, yeah, is that a hand? Anybody have any questions? All right, let's move to our closing statements. Next, oh, sorry, do we have a question?
No.
Oh, yeah, please, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On the awareness side. I've heard that through your argument, you said that awareness would end up leading to character development and character change. What is that? The direct translation? Because when we say we raise awareness of things, human beings, as we all know, have different sides of the coin. It's always one side or the other. How does raising awareness directly translate to positive character development and in turn leading to compassion, like you said?
Great. So one thing that policy does not account for, or cannot solve, is just our behavior. We brought up the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act passed and racism was still around. Policy cannot shape our human behavior. It just doesn't work that way. We can be punished for doing bad things, but ultimately the likelihood of us changing ourselves, our personality, is very, very slim.
And then regarding how protests can lead to, and the awareness it brings can lead to compassion, right? It depends on the organization of the protest. I think that it's kind of just like a core hope you have to hold that most people in this world are probably good people in order to even function, in order to believe that protests have a good reason for existing. And that's something I hold to be true for the most part. We have exceptions, right? But it's how these protests are geared, how they can appeal to that compassion, appeal to that emotion, show people that they are capable, right? And that's something that people often miss. I mean, we're all aware of issues happening every day, but we often feel like we don't have the power or influence to address it when we're isolated. But it's through seeing these people, compassionate people rallying together, we see a good example if it's organized properly and effectively. And that's how I think that the awareness protest garners can kind of take a hold and take advantage of the compassion we all hold.
Response?
We're not discounting that seeing people and the social awareness that spreads from protests is so inspiring, but the main goal should be policy change. Just the social awareness can't ensure this change is going to stick around or that this change is even going to be enough.
Because without that direction, then we heard them earlier when we asked where's the end of the protest? When do we know when they're successful? He said, I don't know. How do we know if it worked, if it didn't work, if it would actually address the issue and how much is left to address? That without those goals to direct the energy that's raised by awareness, it isn't going anywhere.
Well, on the other side, I mean, you've said yourself that sometimes policy isn't enough, yet that's your goal for protests, so I just don't understand. And I'm not going to try to speak for Payton, but I know he said that, you know, issues are going to constantly come up, and it's just like, we're moving in a direction, and protests that raise awareness are pushing us forward, not backwards, at least for the most part. And that's just so much more powerful than calling up your congressman and saying, hey, can you vote for this? No? Okay, well, we're screwed, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think I heard what the saying was that the causes are never done, but I think that's totally fair to say. Okay, I think we have to move to our closing statements now, but let's get a big round of applause for and now I can confidently say, closing out the side that is arguing for non-legislative community action and social change, we have Payton.
All right, now that I have the floor, I know we've been here a while, I just want to thank everybody for showing up. Gives me a lot of hope that, well, we're spreading awareness, right? One thing that I think's kind of interesting is that we can frame this event that we're having here as a kind of protest, right? We at Discourse series recognize that discourse isn't very great. It's not very productive in the society that we live in now. And the whole point of our internship, the whole point of this event is to work on that. We can't say fix it because, as we mentioned earlier, things change, people change, and the world is a very big place, and at the end of the day, we are all just one person, right? Unless we work together. We share our thoughts, we share our struggles, we share our feelings, united under this idea of compassion, right? And sure, policy could come from that, and we'd be happy if policy did, but policies change, policies get stricken down, and as we mentioned earlier, answering the great question somebody over there had, policies are merely a reflection of the time, right? A reflection of the people, and the people are what change. The policy is just a reflection of that. And at the end of the day, I think what's most important when we try to rally people around solving issues is we want to guide our people in a compassionate direction, expose them to problems, flaws that should be mattering to people that they would otherwise be unaware of, right? So, in closing, just think. I mean, you're all sitting here today and you have the will, the desire to listen. There's something in you, at least each of you in this room, that calls you here, right? This idea of protests are interesting, they're important. Maybe I'm just curious, maybe I'm here because Ted's giving me extra credit, whatever it is, right? But I like to think that over the course of this conversation, you've all grown to understand that you have power, a lot of power. You have voices, you have unity. Look around at the people here. I wouldn't have interacted with most of you if I wasn't standing here now, but events like this, circumstances, problems even, is what brings people together. And it's when we recognize that we are people, and we're all compassionate people, and we can unite under shared cultural values pushing forward. We can work on policy, but I think more importantly, we can work on lasting cultural change that will cultivate a better world for our future generations moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Payton. In closing out the side argument for policy, closing out the entire debate, and closing out the entire University of Arizona Discourse Series debate season, we have Jakob.
Also, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and I appreciate the honor of being able to close out this event. And as has been said before, I know many of you are here for greater reasons, but you still asked a lot of very good, thoughtful questions, and you made this a great event. And throughout this event, you've heard a lot of facts and examples and different perspectives thrown at you, and it might have gotten a little muddled. So I just want to boil it down and to some key themes and takeaways. And the key theme that you heard from our opponents is that policy change is not enough, that it does not fix the issues, that we need more cultural change to address them. But think about the wide variety of student protests and other protests we've seen that while they haven't fixed the issues, they've made a real difference. Imagine if we lived in a world where apartheid still existed by not ending those policies, where we lived in a world where segregation still existed, where we had not had the protest against those policies, where we had not taken steps towards addressing climate change and gun violence and other issues. Imagine if we were in that world where we had not had those changes. And you've heard our opponents talk about the benefit of focusing on emotional and social awareness, but they've also acknowledged that certain pressing issues need a policy change. Think gun violence, that yes, cultural values are important, but we can't just have a conversation out of something like gun violence. And also, the end, we can't really know if the protests have been successful if they don't have a specific goal. But ultimately, this debate has meaning outside this room. You have issues that you care about, that you want to see change on. Imagine what we could accomplish if every student protest wasn't just a call to action, but a call to policy. From divestment campaigns to better legislation, from gun reform to educational equity, focusing on policy change ensures that our voices don't just echo, but they endure. And if you take away one thing from this debate, let it be this: while awareness is important and a crucial stepping stone, it is policy that transforms this awareness into action, and action into lasting change. Use what you've learned from past lessons. Don't let failure discourage you, and always keep moving forward. And ultimately, I want to end with a quote from Barack Obama. Change will not come if we wait for some other person or if we wait for some other time. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek, and policy is our vessel for that change. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. All right, excellent. Michaela, go ahead and get ready to tally those votes because Tommy's a hero and went and printed out the QR code because we couldn't get the video to work. So hopefully you guys are all right now getting a copy of the QR code on paper. Just go ahead and scan that and vote for either of our two sides. And in just a couple of minutes, we are going to let you know who our winner is. But go ahead and pass that around. While you're passing that around, I do just want to make a few announcements. Again, we are the University of Arizona Discourse Series. We have some excellent interns, but some of them are graduating, sadly, in the middle of the year. I'm actually very resentful of them for doing that, which means that we have a lot of openings coming up as the spring. If anybody's interested in applying to our internship, you're more than welcome to. It's a 3-credit internship per semester. So come up and talk to any of our absolutely excellent interns after our debate if you have questions about that. This year's theme has been the state of higher education, as you can probably tell from the fact that we're talking about student protests this evening. We've been traveling a whole lot. We were in Florida on election night. We were in Washington, D.C. in September, talking about some really great issues. And coming up in the spring, we are putting together some really excellent events. So please make sure you follow all of our social media on Instagram and on Twitter and on TikTok. We have an absolutely excellent TikTok starring these two ladies right here. So make sure you follow us on all of our social media. That's the best place to get all the information about our future events. At this point, I'm sort of just stalling as I'm waiting for the votes to all come in. Has everybody voted at this point? Are we waiting on anybody yet? We're waiting on just a couple more people. Where's Michaela? You got most of them?
Yeah.
All right, let's wait just a minute or two more while we have the rest of the votes come in. And we're very excited to find out. But I do want to say one more round of applause for all 4 of our debaters before we find out who is. And I'll very much agree with Jacob, even though it was, I think, largely a technique to win by kissing up to the audience. You guys were an absolutely excellent audience and asked some really excellent questions, so thank you for that. But I think at this point now, everyone has voted, so the votes are in. And okay. And finishing it up with 45.2% of the vote, Logan and Payton, which means that the winners of our debate with 54.8% of the vote are Jacob and Riley. Congratulations to Jacob and Riley. Guys, thank you very much for coming on out. Those of you who are here for extra credit, I will open up a box on TCY. You can submit there. Anybody who's here for Regents Cup, come on up and talk to me. I'm very excited to help with you. Tomorrow, anyone who's here just for the hell of it, thank you very much for coming. I think we still have pizza left. Go grab yourself some. Thank you very much.
The point where I went like,
Take this down. Did any random balloons or stars show up? So just keep it